Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 18th of June of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And as usually, the most important, the most interesting updates are coming from Orechov front line, and to be more precise, from the western flank of that front line, from the small settlement by the name of Petykhatki. This is the settlement. If you know, the Ukrainians during the previous days made a lot of attempts to conquer this settlement. They were sending one wave after another, and mainly according to the Western deployments map and the sources we have, the Ukrainians were using the forces of 128th Mountain Assault Brigade and the forces of 65th Mechanized Brigade and the forces of 113th Reconnaissance Battalion. We discussed that operation many times, and we were saying that Ukrainians were attacking the Russian forces from the western flank through the fields, through the forests in direction of the western edge of that settlement, and as a result of those attacks during the previous days, they managed to capture the western part of that settlement. Today the Russians published the video how the Ukrainians, so this is Petykhatki, I believe you can recognize these streets and this line, and this is the street and this is the interception on that you can see, and you can find on the video on the interception on the north on the top of that video, and this is the forest on the south. Of course, from this video this forest is not so big as we can and not so massive as we can see from the satellite. Probably this more not just the forest like brushes and trees, separate trees, but anyway, as we discussed, the Ukrainians were trying to attack the settlement from the western part. They tried to hide their vehicles, tanks inside of the brushes between the trees and so on, and they were bombing and shelling the the Russian positions in the settlement. They were trying to enter those vehicles. Armored vehicles were under Russian attack. A lot of vehicles were destroyed, but anyway, as a result of those fierce fightings, the Ukrainians managed to enter and to establish the 100% control over that settlement. According to the Russian sources, the Russian forces were forced to step back to the south towards more reliable positions, and currently the Russians have their defense belt to the south of that settlement along the road somewhere on this area, and this line goes to the north. So this red line is the Russians' defense belt currently. Maybe during the day this picture has been changed. For now we don't have any video or photo confirmation of that. Anyway, the Russians were trying to return control over the settlement for a few times. They made attacks in direction of Petykhatki, and mainly the Russians were trying to attack this small settlement from another settlement by the name of Zherebyanki. On this video that were published by the Russians, you see that a convoy of Russian armored vehicles were heading to Petykhatki through Zherebyanki along the road. Basically, on this video you can see the on the top right corner is Zherebyanki itself. This is the road to the south, and if you can follow my mouse, you can see the fortifications that I'm trying to show you on the screen, and this is the fortification line on the video. And the Russians were heading to the north, not to the north, along the road in direction of Petykhatki. And from these positions, now currently you can see this map, you see at least 3 tanks or 3 different types of armored vehicles, and you see on the south, on the bottom corner of this video, you see a small interception. And basically, if you take a look at this video, this is the interception. The Russians armored vehicles got their positions. So basically the Russians sent their main reserves, probably not even from Zherebyanki but from Lugovo, or even further somewhere from Vasilievka or Verkhnya Krynytsa. They sent their reserve, their tank forces. The tank forces established their positions on this line, and from these positions the Russians started attacking, bombing the Ukrainians in the forest and in the western part, trying to slow down their movements, to slow down their speed, and not to allow them to be flexible and mobile, and not to capture the entire Petykhatki, and not to allow them to capture the central and the eastern part of that settlement. So let's continue with this video. So as you can see, the Russians were established their position in this interception, and from these positions they were attacking the western edge of Petykhatki, trying to destroy the Ukrainians' armored vehicles, tanks, infantry positions, and so on. And we see the smoke in this area. This is the Ukrainian tank somewhere in the corner, the Ukrainian, and very soon, as a result of artillery attack, that armored vehicle was destroyed. On this video you can see that some Ukrainians managed to hide their vehicles, vehicles, but anyway, all of them were destroyed and spotted by the Russians. Of course, the Russians published the video where they were attacking the Ukrainians, but anyway, as a result of those fightings, the Russians were forced to step back and the Ukrainians entered this settlement, and they were trying to create their own fortifications to prepare themselves until the Russians will start bombing and shelling this area with flamethrower systems, with Krasnopil shells and so on. And the Russians are saying that Ukrainians couldn't do this. They didn't have much time. The Russians start bombing and shelling, and according to the Russian sources, the Ukrainians lost a lot of soldiers and so on. But maybe this is some kind of speculation from the Russian side. For now, we still haven't received any numbers, neither any photo video confirmation of massive bodies lying along the Petykhatki. Anyway, no matter the situation, the Ukrainians managed to establish control, and currently they will move more reserves, more forces to the settlement. And the next target and the next thing that Ukrainians will try to do is to develop this bridgehead to the east, to the south, and to the west. The easiest direction for the Ukrainians, of course, is to develop their bridgehead to the east. I won't be surprised if the Russians have already left this territory, because these fortifications were supported by the Russians through Petykhatki, and currently there are no more supply road that goes to this settlement, to these fortifications, to this line. So I won't be surprised if the Russians have already left this area, and everything that lays on the north, on the top of this line, is already under Ukrainian control. The next thing that Ukrainians will try to do is to develop their bridgehead to the west from Lapkova. They will try to get the next defense belt, the Russians' defense belt along this forest line, and the main purpose of that attack is to establish control over the area on the north of this yellow line. They need to get their forces there, their tanks, their armored vehicles, and to cut supply road that goes from Lugova, this small settlement Lugova, to Zherebyanki, and to cut Zherebyanki from supply and support. And I believe that this is going to be the next target of the Ukrainians within the next few days. It's not an operation of 1 or 2 days. Probably it will take more, because for now they need to take this defense belt to secure the flanks and then to continue. And I'm not even saying that the Ukrainians even are able to do this, because during the previous days the Ukrainians made another massacre, another meat grinder from their side. The losses are very heavy, so I'm not sure, and I will be very surprised if the soldiers will follow these orders, and if they're not going to refuse following this massacre and meat grinder orders. So we'll see. Anyway, as we can see from this screen, you see that currently the Ukrainians managed to get the first defense line, at least on this part of the front line. We saw even the fortifications from the video, so it's not going to be a very easy job for them, but anyway, they don't have any other option. They need to show results before July NATO summit that will take place on the 10th of July. So not much time left before this event is going to happen. Now we are moving further to Orekhov bridgehead, where the Ukrainians made another massive wave of attacks on the Russian positions. And before we start discussing this situation, you need to know and need to understand one thing. A lot of mappers, a lot of bloggers have already made updates on this map, showing that Ukrainians managed to capture these flanks in the vicinity of Robotin of the western or the eastern or something else. I'll give you my opinion. Currently, it's too early to make any updates on any maps about the bridgehead in the vicinity between Novodanilovka, Robotina, Verbova, and Novopokrovka. Currently, it's too early to do this. Basically, this entire territory that I will go into show you right now on the map, this one is in the gray zone. All these fields this territory is in the gray zone, and this territory, these fields, change its owner during the day probably 5 or 6 times, because there were a lot of video and photo confirmations that Ukrainians managed to get very deep to the south among these fields, and Ukrainians of course reported that they managed to advance. A lot of different Western mappers have already updated their maps based on that progress, but later after that the Russians made, for example, drone attacks, and most of the armored vehicles among these fields were destroyed by the Russians. So basically I'm trying to tell you that it's too early to make any changes. Currently this is the battlefield, and where we see the battles between Ukrainian armored vehicles and the Russians' armored vehicles. The only thing that we can do currently is just to draw arrows and to show the Ukrainians directions of their attacks. This is the first one on the, let's say, right side of the road between Novodonetskaya and Rabotina. The second attack is on the left side of the same road. Furthermore, the Ukrainians are trying to advance among the fields to the south in direction of the first defense belt of the Russian forces, and of course the Ukrainians are trying to attack from Mala Takmachka in direction of Novopokrovka. According to the Ministry of Defense, all those attempts were repelled and in the past and currently are repelling by the Russians. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation also added that as a result of those fierce fightings exactly on these fields, the Ukrainians lost 200 soldiers, 33 tanks, 30 personal armored carriers and 35 armored vehicles. So as you can see, the loss of the Ukrainians are very heavy, and this is another topic that I would like to discuss with you. Currently, there are not just war and battle, let's say, on the field. There is a very fierce fightings in the media, and the Russians started massive media attack against the Ukrainians' minds, against the Western sources' minds, and so on. For example, during the previous days, the Russians, and the previous video, if you saw the previous video that I made this morning of the local time, that video was about the massive, that Ukrainians start massive surrendering process. A lot of soldiers were captured, and this is a real information. This is real information from the front lines and so on. But this is a media attack. Believe me, hundreds and probably dozens of Ukrainian soldiers surrendered the day before yesterday, and so on. But today the Russians took a decision to publish these videos, trying to show the Ukrainians that there is no need to fight, that there is no reason to fight, and anyway everything will be ended or with two ways: or you will surrender, or you or your armored vehicle will be destroyed under Russian fire. Another media attack from the Russian side, for example, took place a few days ago. If you remember, the Russians reported that forces of 47th Mechanized Brigade took a decision not to attack. If you remember, there was a small operational pause in this area and so on. And currently, the Russians started another very smart and very interesting media attack, saying that the Ukrainians have changed their tactics. You see, I believe you've seen a lot of videos on that topic saying that Ukrainians have changed their tactics, and recently before this, today, the Ukrainians were attacking using the broad frontline attacks under support of tanks. They were attacking the Russian positions, and starting from probably yesterday and the day before yesterday, the Russian sources are saying that the Ukrainians have changed their tactics, and currently they're using just platoons for attack under support of light vehicles and so on. You need to understand that that was another media attack from the Russians, because just imagine yourself, how could it's even impossible. I can't even imagine myself any attack on these fortifications in the vicinity of Rabotina and Zaporozhye area without support of any tanks. So tanks is the base of any offensive operation. If you don't have tanks, then you can't even start offensive operation against the fortifications. And if you spread such a piece of information, just imagine yourself condition and what Ukrainian soldiers on the ground will start think if they receive this piece of information, because they can't also imagine themselves attack towards Russian positions without support of tanks. That was another media attack from the Russian side. Believe me, the Ukrainians haven't changed their tactics. They continue using broad frontline attacks, using massive usage of Western tanks, and the report of the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation confirms this, that the Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours they lost 33 tanks, 30 personal armored carriers and 35 armored vehicles. And that discussions and that piece of disinformation about changing of the Ukrainian tactics was just about to force the Ukrainian soldiers on the ground to refuse and to make strikes on the combat line and not to follow the orders, because most of the Ukrainian soldiers do have access to the internet, they have possibilities to read news, and they also subscribe on the Russian military channels of military experts like Rybar and many others. And I believe you also subscribed on those channels. So this is the situation on Orekhov front line. Furthermore, the Russians reported that Ukrainians were trying to send some reserves during the day from Mala-Takhmachka to the south. The Russians managed to discover and to destroy those forces, and the Ukrainians lost around 9 tanks, 10 personal armored carriers, and 10 armored vehicles of different types. Furthermore, the Russians published another video how they were using helicopters on Vremivka tactical bridgehead and on the Orekhov bridgehead. As you can see, based on that video, the Russians, as a result of usage of guided missiles, managed to destroy up to 3 armored vehicles just on this video. Almost every single day the Russians published more and more new videos about usage of helicopters, and we see that the Ukrainians still couldn't find a solution how to shut down Russian helicopters, and this is a very big pain for them. And this is another media attack from the Russian side, trying to show that it's useless to attack, useless to follow your orders, because anyway you have 2 options: or you will be killed under Russian fire, or you will surrender. So this is the war, this is the modern warfare that we need to understand as well, and we need to filtrate the information we receive from the media. Now we're moving further. The Russians reported that they attacked the Ukrainian positions. They bombed the Ukrainian positions in the vicinity of Gulay-Polya. When talking about particularly this front line, the Ukrainians are trying to use just commandos, squads, and scouts, and to use Gulay-Polya as logistic hub to move forces from Vremivka tactical bridgehead to Orekhov, and back from Orekhov to Vremivka tactical bridgehead. So as I understand, the Russians were attacking those logistic roads between these 2 settlements, using not even accurate shells, but just regular missiles and nothing more. Now we are getting to the Vremivka tactical bridgehead. There were very heavy clashes during the previous 24 hours. The Ukrainians, as usually, were trying to attack the Russians' positions in direction of Rovnopol from the west. The Ukrainians were trying to attack the Russians from the northwest. All those attempts were repelled by the Russian forces in that small settlement. The Ukrainians were trying to attack the Russians in the vicinity of Novodonetsk, but that attack was repelled by the Russian forces. And the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported that the total losses during the previous 24 hours were around 180 soldiers, 2 tanks, 3 personal armored carriers, and 3 armored vehicles, when talking particularly about this front line. Furthermore, the Russians published the video how they destroyed Ukrainian tank, probably of a 4th tank brigade, somewhere in the vicinity between Blagodatna and Novodonetsk, using the Lancet drone. On this video, we see how the Ukrainian tanks goes around along the brushes, along the forest lines. Maybe these tanks were moving, let's say, on fire positions, and currently we see that the Russians drone discovered the Ukrainian tank and start flying in direction of that tank, right behind the tank. And the second drone that probably coordinated the first drone, Lancet drone, saved the video, and basically on this video you see how the drone attacked this tank behind. And currently I believe that this tank is no longer Ukrainians are no longer available to use this tank in the future. And now we are moving further to Donetsk. Another important update, that the Russians continue artillery duels, and today they reported they destroy another M777 howitzer 47th artillery brigade in the vicinity of Shakhterskaya. When talking about Marinka and Avdiivka bridgehead, there were no changes during the day. The Russians destroyed Raider NTPQ-15 in the vicinity of Maxim Emelianovka. The Russians attacked the positions of 79th Air Assault Brigade in the vicinity of Pobeda. The Russians attacked the Ukrainians 110th Brigade in Avdiivka. The Russians repelled Ukrainians' attacks from Krasnogorovka in direction of Marinka. The Russians repelled another attack in direction of from Nivelskaya. The Russians attacked any attempts to restore lost positions in the vicinity of Pervomaiska, and of course the Russians managed to repel the Ukrainians' attack in the vicinity of Krasnogorovka from Novokalinova. During the previous 24 hours, when talking about Donetsk front line, the Ukrainians lost 210 soldiers, 8 armored vehicles, and 1 artillery system. When talking about New York agglomeration, the Russians continue bombing bombing and shelling the Ukrainian positions, and they destroy just a few ammo depots of 109th Brigade and of 129th Brigade as well. We haven't received any updates about the clashes from Artyomovsk. Probably the Ukrainians took small operational pause, or we still haven't received maybe just video confirmation. Maybe later this evening of the local time we're gonna got some updates, but for now the situation is stable. The Russians managed to stabilize the situation in this area, and the Ukrainians stopped doing any attempt to attack the Russian flanks. Probably everybody waits how the battle of Zaporozhye and Vremivka are going to finish, and because I'm not saying that this battle is going to be finished very soon, but the 10th of July, the beginning of July, is the deadline for the Ukrainian sources, and based on the Western press, Western media, the Ukrainians promised to by the 10th of July to get the outskirts of Melitopol, and they are still very close to this target. And I'm not even sure that they can get Tokmak before the 10th of July, but they have very optimistic plans, so let's see. When talking about Liman frontline, Seversbrüch, Kupiansk and so on, there were no changes, just regular clashes, fightings with commandos and scouts. The Ukrainians haven't made any attempt to make counteroffensive in direction of Dibrovo or the salient, so probably they were doing some kind of took a small operational pause. And the very interesting updates, for example, are coming from Kupiansk front line. If you remember, the Russians during the previous weeks managed to capture the small settlement Novomlinsk, cross Oskol River, and they managed to capture and establish bridgehead to the south of Dvoreshno, to the north. And today, for the first time since the beginning of the Battle of Dvoreshno, let's call it like this, the Russians reported that they started bombing and shelling the Ukrainian positions in the small settlement by Fugolivka on the west from Novomlinsk. So the Russians start preparation before further offensive operation in that direction, and probably we're going to see some intensifying of actions within the next two or 3 weeks. The Russians reported the total losses of the Ukrainians on this front line from Kupiansk to Liman were around 130 soldiers, 6 armored vehicles and 4 artillery systems. As you can see, the level of losses is almost the same as they used to be in the previous days, and so on. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in Ukraine, in the world as well. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.